Hello, this is the video for Thursday, January 7th for 11th grade English. Today we are formally launching the last unit, the last tiny unit on the Civil War. The Civil War unit is really more of a topic that you need to use for your final. So what I'm actually focused on is our skill of doing a précis, but I need to give you content that's meaningful for you to write something about, and we've chosen the Civil War. So I'll walk you through some slides today, and then we're going to go through one of the texts that's going to be there for the précis. This is a chapter from a really great novel, so we'll read that today, and the stem is they fought for each other. So I'm going to just launch right in with the Civil War in memory, and that's what we're terming the unit because I'm really interested in memory and how we're remembering the war as much as I'm interested in the war itself. So I'm assuming you know a little bit about the Civil War, especially if you're in U.S. history right now where it's really fresh, but I'm still going to go through the basics. Otherwise, what we're going to read doesn't really resonate. Okay, so the causes of the Civil War, I'm going to call them sectional again and again. Sectional just means the sections of the country, the North and the South in this case. And there's also this developing section to the west of the territories that are not quite states. So mounting sectional tensions and a failure of political will led to the Civil War, in a nutshell. Here you have the North, which is more industrial, and the South, which is more agricultural. They developed different industries, they placed value on different industries, and that created tension. And then a failure of political will. So this give up, it's not worth it. The politicians on both sides gave up eventually in trying to find compromise and a diplomatic solution, which leads to war. More specifically, though, what is that? And a lot of these you'll see revolve around the issue of slavery, which is foundational to all of the disagreements. So here, those disagreements and debates over a lot of things caused the war, including tariffs, extension of slavery into the territories, and argument over whether each state should decide on slavery for itself. Tariffs, by the way, are a tax or a duty. It's also sometimes called a duty in this context that a government places on goods coming into and out of the country, on imports and exports. And there was disagreement about how that should take place. And then there were all these other disagreements about the industry of slavery, which this is in purely economic terms. Another cause related to slavery is a more emotional fight and more about the moral virtues or lack of virtues with slavery between Northern abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison, and then Southern defenders of slavery. Abolitionists, people who support an immediate end to slavery, and the people who are defending the institution in the South. The third cause is really a very specific case in the institution of slavery. This was tried when I was in St. Louis as a little girl. We went to reenact it at the St. Louis courthouse. It was tried in St. Louis. So we went to reenact it to try to appreciate the gravity of the decision. And I remember that. I remember being in fourth grade and remembering this is a big deal, I guess, which is about as much as I understood in fourth grade. I understand it now much better. Dred Scott was a slave who was born in Virginia, actually, and traveled with his owner around the country. They lived in Missouri for a while. They lived in free states as well, though, Illinois, Wisconsin. And Dred Scott brought to trial his case. He sued for his freedom and said that because he had spent time in a free territory, he should be freed. Those states which had outlawed slavery had written that nobody could be enslaved in those states, and that a slaveholder who moved there had to relinquish their slaves. So he used that argument to say, I should be freed. But the Supreme Court ruled against him. They ruled in 1857 that no black, free or slave, could be a U.S. citizen fully and could not bring a trial to court. They also agreed that his time in a free state didn't mean he could be freed. So a blow to Dred Scott for sure, but also it really shows you how territorial the issue of slavery was. That he moved around highlighted just how different and how filled with discrepancies was the United States in its treatment towards slaves and in its conception of what slavery meant. So Northern abolitionists were really angry and tensions increased. Another cause, a more cultural cause, was the publication of the book Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. It's a book about Tom who stands up for his beliefs. It inspired a lot of Americans to become abolitionists. That's a simple story. It's a lot more complex if you're interested in learning more about Uncle Tom's Cabin. Itself, it is probably now we would consider a somewhat racist text, but it did at the time inspire a lot of people to want to outlaw slavery. Another cause, just bad leadership. The presidents at the time were just trying to ignore the most grave issue facing the country, slavery, much like the early founding fathers we studied in Cabinet Battle Number 3. And here you have the map of where slavery was allowed, where it was outlawed, and there were a series of failed compromises over what to do as the country grew. Perhaps they would have decided with some conviction and not as much strife on how to separate the nation into the free and the slave states, though we don't know how that would have resolved. But the thing that kept pushing the pressure was the expansion west. So as America grew and moved into these territories, the question kept coming before Congress. Well, will we admit them as a slave state or a free state? Of course, the free states wanted each new territory to be admitted as a free state, and the South wanted the opposite. So this, you might have heard some of the compromises. The Missouri Compromise of 1850 is perhaps the most famous, created this constant difficulty in the conversation. And here, the last cause. This would be the flashpoint. So all of the kindling had been set. All of the wood was stacked. There was a lot of fiery opposition, and there was already much talk of war. But war has to start somewhere. And it started with a battle here, the attack on Fort Sumter. So the fort is in Charleston, South Carolina. And the federal government occupied it because it was a federal fort. Then leaders in South Carolina demanded that they pull their troops out of the fort. And Lincoln, who was president at the time, refused to do so. And so the South Carolina local state militia attacked the fort. So what is that? A state militia attacking the federal. That's a war. In this case, the beginning of the Civil War, April 13th, 1861. The war would last about 4 years. So it begins, federal troops start organizing to fight this war. Abraham Lincoln is worth a little bit of an aside. He was elected president just as the Civil War was getting started. In fact, his election was itself a bit of a cause. It created a lot of anger in the South, and people didn't see him as somebody who would be an advocate for them in their rights to own slaves, which indeed he was not in the end. So he said the Union should hold together by force if necessary. And he believed, above all, that America was one nation, not a collection of independent states. Were he to have embodied that last bullet point, there would have been a different story of America. And this is indeed the story of the war. Is a state allowed to claim its own independence? Or is America, the body, going to always rule over each of the independent states? They're not entirely independent. So there's this moment where we can pause and read this excerpt from Stamped. It's a quick excerpt, and I'm just going to pull up an example of it. You can read this in more depth if you like. I'm just going to read the part that I'd like to share with the class, though. Jason Reynolds writes this book, Stamped. It's great. I think every 11th grader might even have it, as a distilled version of Ibram Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning, which I really recommend. Stamped from the Beginning is a work of history. This is also, but this is claiming not to be. It says this is about the here and now, and this is just a book trying to help you understand the context of where we are and why we're here. So everything is written through that lens. And chapter 13, page 74 is really about Abraham Lincoln. So I wanted to pause for a moment and point out some things that we can see about Lincoln in this text. All right, so Kendi and Reynolds, Jason Reynolds, write, Lincoln was against black voting, and Lincoln was against racial equality. Lincoln and the party pledged not to challenge Southern slavery, and Lincoln won the presidency. So you can see already, it's not like it was as simple as the North was anti-slavery, and so was Lincoln, and they were going to keep that promise no matter what. It was always about politics as well. So Lincoln, the 16th president, when he ascended into place, untrusting slaveholders broke into a panic that the economic institution that kept them living like kings would be in jeopardy, panic that they wouldn't be able to stop slave revolts and would be overthrown, like Haiti with Toussaint Louverture. And so they did what most people, well, what most bullies do when they've been bested on the playground. They, the South, took their ball and left the nation. So this is the part I really wanted to get into for our slides today. The secession, which just means to withdraw from being a member of, not to be confused with succession, which means a line of people sharing a role one after the other, not to be confused with success, which means to win, because that didn't happen, started with South Carolina. They left the Union, which means they were starting their own territory where they could make up their own rules and live their lives as racist as they wanted. You can see Kendi and Reynolds' perspective here. That is true, though, so they could maintain their grip, vice-like, on the institution of slavery. Shortly thereafter, the rest of the South joined in on the disjoining. This was a big deal because to lose an entire region meant that the other states lost that region's resources, all the land, the crops, the people, the wealth. But it happened, and the split-offs called themselves the Confederacy. They voted in their own president, Jefferson Davis, who had declared that black people should never and would never be equal to whites. There were now two governments like rival gangs, and what have gangs always done when one gang feels their turf is being threatened? Fight. Welcome to the Civil War. So that is a nice introduction into where we are. Reynolds goes on to write about really the way that the slaves were part of the war and wanted and sought and actively fought for their own freedom. I think this line is particularly worth reading out loud. Lincoln was labeled the great emancipator. He was going to free the slaves, but really, black people were emancipating themselves. By the end of 1863, 400,000 black people had escaped their plantations and found Union lines, meaning 400,000 black people had found freedom. So there's a lot of layers to what's happening in the Civil War. It's not simply North versus South. But when it comes to the battles and when it comes to the war, it sometimes is that simple, a fight, this troop against that. So we'll go back to look at what that meant in the war. Here's your summary again. The secession, breaking away of Southern states, triggered a war that concluded with the North winning and resulted in the return of the Union and the emancipation, which means the freedom, the freeing of the slaves. So why is this important? We'll get into this a little bit later after we've talked about all of this, but it put constitutional government to its most important test. What is the role of the federal government? And at that moment in history, it was really unclear whether the United States would survive. So the nation's ability to bring to reality their ideals of liberty, equality, and justice all depended on what would happen in the war. And that would be military. Here's this reminder that it started with a fight in South Carolina, where South Carolinians fired upon the federal fort. So there's a couple key battles, and we're going to end today with a focus on Gettysburg. And in fact, I'm going to go there just so that we can keep things tight and organized. There are a lot of battles in the Civil War. We're focusing on Gettysburg because it was the turning point of the war. There had already been 2 years of fighting. This battle changed the nature of the fight. It really meant that the North was in charge and could likely win this. So why and how? I want to focus on that because I think the text about Gettysburg has really interesting insights about the war at large. So we're placing an unreal emphasis on Gettysburg because that's our text that we have. And here is that text. It's an excellent text. It's a historical fiction novel about the Battle of Gettysburg and won the Pulitzer Prize in 1975 for fiction. We're going to offer 2 chapters. The first is from the perspective of Colonel Chamberlain, and the second is from the perspective of General Lee, Robert E. Lee. So today's is the perspective from Chamberlain. What I'd like you to do is read the intro about the men. I've got the clips here that will help you understand the reading, and then read this excerpt in order to do your stem, which is they fought for each other. So read the chapter, do the stem. Thank you very much.